I made myself an ironing mat, and it's probably one of the most useful things I've ever made for myself. And in this video, I'll show you how I did it. Let me start off with the very first, most basic question. Why? Because this is what I've been working with for the past couple of years. A sleeve ironing board, a small tabletop ironing board, a wooden plank, which is actually a cutting board, but I only ironed on this side, and my wooden clapper. For pressing seams during garment construction, as well as for ironing finished garments after laundry, I tend to prefer working on this sleeve ironing board, as it allows for way more precision than on a big flat working surface. But for pressing yardage and big pieces of fabric after pre-washing them, these boards were obviously never really sufficient. We live in a small apartment and literally don't have any space to store a tall standing ironing board, so I've been meaning to make a foldable or rollable ironing mat for ages now. Earlier this summer, I decided I have been procrastinating this project for way too long and decided I might be better off just buying one instead. So I started researching, but I found something else instead. My motivation to actually finally make my own. What made me change my mind? Quite possibly the horrendous marketing efforts of the ironing mats that I found online. They didn't really feel convincing or competent. Just push that iron on top of your shorts. Sure. And who needs front pleats anyways? Why not just iron them away? And this one just made me laugh, because what are you looking at, lady? Another one, more interested in the camera than her iron. This woman also prefers to look in a completely different direction than her iron. Oh, and these Fahrenheit to Celsius conversions also don't make any sense. Anyways, I think you get the point. I had a good laugh about all these product shots online, but couldn't really find any close to the size that I was hoping for, which was to cover my entire cutting mat. So let's go back to the original plan and let's make my own. I was able to make the ironing mat using mostly materials I already had at home. This is a bonded cotton I ordered online, which unfortunately turned out to be a bit stiffer and heavier than I hoped for. I've used some of it, but still had a bunch laying around, and it seemed like a great option to give the mat some body and firmness. It is 100% cotton, which was my main requirement when I was looking for fabrics in my stash, because it needs to withstand the highest settings of an iron. I couldn't really find any solid answers whether the bonding that keeps those two layers of cotton together would also be able to withstand such an abundance of heat over and over again. So for that reason, I decided to use the bonded cotton as the backing layer, which would be exposed to significantly less heat than the upper main layer. For that main layer, I used this fil-a-fil cotton. Green threads on grain and white threads cross grain, creating a beautiful light shade of green. Of course, 100% cotton again. Originally a set of IKEA curtains from my old apartment, which I've been using for linings and wearable toiles since I didn't need them anymore. Then the only thing I ended up buying for this project, heat-resistant batting. This is Insole Bright. It's a type of insulated batting that can be used for items that need to withstand high heat. Think of pot holders, oven mitts, or ironing board covers. It's made from polyester fibers with a metallic polyfilm in the middle to reflect the heat or the cold. It can also be used for cooling purposes. The polyester fibers are needle through, which makes the batting breathable, but also means that it's not waterproof. So it will protect the surface underneath the ironing mat from heat, but not from moisture if I would be using steam. Lastly, don't forget about the smaller details. Also for my sewing thread, I'm using 100% cotton to make this ironing mat. I decided to go for a more subtle look with white quilting lines instead of the high contrast black. So let's get started. The Insole Bright batting that I ordered was sold by the meter, and the width of the roll was about 57 centimeters, which turned out to be the perfect size for my table and cutting mat. Not because it covers the table in one go, but because the 29 centimeters I was missing to cover the full 86 centimeters of my cutting mat was a near identical match with half the width of the roll of batting. Still with me? Those were a lot of numbers, I'm sorry. In easier language, I ordered 3 times the length that I wanted my ironing mat to be. For me, that was 4 meters, which I cut up in 3 equal lengths, and I cut one of those pieces in half, lengthwise. This narrow piece was now the perfect size to fill up the remaining width I needed to cover the table. And I used the second narrow piece, plus the other full width piece, as a second layer of batting. Firstly, because more batting is more protection. And secondly, because a seam between 2 pieces of this batting could risk some heat still going through. By having each layer in the opposite direction, I could protect my cutting mat underneath, even below those seams. To start off, I basted the 4 batting pieces together by hand. I aligned one of the narrow pieces right on top of one of the 2 bigger pieces, basted it in place, and then aligned the second bigger piece right next to the narrow one, which created that first seam in the batting. Basted that piece in place as well. First with a quick running stitch, and then another stitch zigzagging between those 2 upper layers so I could pull them tighter against each other. And the only reason I suddenly switched to black thread is because it's so much easier to see on video. Then flip the whole thing around. And again, basted the 2 pieces together, this time along the seam on the other side, and added the last narrow piece. Same thing, first a quick running stitch to secure it in place, and then one more stitch to pull them tighter together. To speed things up, I switched to a basic diagonal basting stitch on this seam. And this was the final full-size layer of batting. Both of those seams in the batting are protected by the second layer of batting. Time for the real deal, let's get quilting. I started by marking a 10 by 10 cm grid on the backing layer, the sturdy bonded cotton. I'm using a black Pilot friction pen, which is heat erasable. I used 2 60 cm rulers and the grids of my cutting mat to make sure that all of my angles were consistent. Of course, you can use any shape and spacing for these quilting lines, or even skip it altogether and go straight into the binding. I specifically wanted to go for a 10 by 10 grid because I'm hoping that I can also use it as a blocking mat for lightweight knitwear projects. And then I can easily use the grid for size reference. Quick machine prep, load up enough bobbins ahead of time, and then it was time to start stitching that grid. The hardest part is pretty much fabric management. I constantly tried to roll the sides up to reduce the total surface area I was handling through my machine. I started in the middle, working my way outwards, so I could constantly pull the layers tight again from that previous stitch line. I also pulled my sewing table forward a bit, so I could let the mat fall down between the table and the wall. After a while, it really starts to feel like a workout. The weight starts pulling it in every single direction, so you need to gently lift it while sewing to make sure that gravity cannot pull it at a different speed or in a different direction than the speed at which the feed dogs of your machine are guiding the fabric through. It's a bit hard to see, but here I'm trying to sit with my left knee as far sideways as possible, so I can let some of the mat rest on that knee, which reduces the amount of weight that's hanging freely, which in turn reduces the amount of pulling gravity can be using against me. And after a bit more puffing, reconsidering my life choices, and other sounds of heavy effort, my grid was done. Back to the table where I marked the final outer edges of the mat, 5 cm from the outermost grid lines, connected by rounded corners. I followed the line all the way around to secure all layers once more, then cut off the excess about 5 mm away from that stitch line. It was really starting to look like the final thing now, but there was one more thing that I wanted to do before starting the binding. Erasing those pen lines. Which honestly still feels like magic to me. Look at those lines just disappearing into thin air. Here in the middle I accidentally started my grid in the wrong spot, and you can see that the pen does leave a faint line on this fabric. So be careful when using these pens in places where you really don't want to leave any marks. Because these friction pens can sometimes also reappear in colder temperatures, so use with caution. After carefully ironing over all the stitch lines to remove those markings underneath, it was finally time for the binding. I had just finished sewing this shirt in a really nice paper touch poplin, 100% cotton again, and I really like the combination of the lilac with the green, so green binding. I was able to cut just enough strips of binding using only oddly shaped scrap pieces. I only cut 4 small pieces on the bias to use those for the rounded corners, and cut the remaining lengths for the straight edges on the straight grain to make the most out of the scraps I had. When binding curves, I prefer to ease my way around the corner as I go, opposed to measuring the lengths up front. So I clipped 4 long strips of binding around the edges like this, with the bias cut sections at each corner. I also finally came to the realization that it made way more sense to move that machine to the big cutting table, so I had way more table space to work with. Could have helped when stitching that grid over there. Made sure to leave myself enough space at the start to connect the binding strips later on, and then attach the binding along the straight edge and the corner. Rinse and repeat, close those 4 gaps in the binding strips, and secure the binding in those 4 remaining sections. Almost there now. All machine sewing work was completed, because I always like to do the second pass of my binding by hand to make it invisible. So I gently folded the binding around and pressed it in place, to then secure it along the entire edge with pins, ready for some hand sewing. Waxed a couple of lengths of cotton thread up front and attached the binding with an invisible stitch all the way around. Because I used poplin for the binding, which is pretty densely woven, I used my finest hand sewing needles here. They are tiny. I lengthened a lilac scrap piece of elastic with a green scrap piece of poplin to create a short string. Took a white hook from a hook and bar closure and added it onto the binding with a buttonhole stitch. And that was it! As mentioned before, the materials I used and the way I constructed it unfortunately doesn't allow for excessive steaming. This is what happens. The vapor goes straight through the mat, so moisture will enter or build up on the surface underneath. After letting it air out for a bit, you can recognize the grid lines. That is where the vapor passed through the mat. So to protect my cutting mat, I'll be using steam sparingly. I also tested ironing without steam to check if the Insulbright batting blocked the heat correctly. After holding the iron still in one spot, the top was of course very hot to the touch, but the backside wasn't hot at all. And neither was the cutting mat. So that's a success. If you do want to use a little steam but keep the surface underneath protected from moisture, you could of course put a waterproof layer underneath the mat. But keep in mind that you then still need to deal with a buildup of moisture between the two layers. For me, I'm not too worried about it, because I'm mostly planning to use this mat to press fabrics that are already damp from pre-washing them. And if I really want to use a lot of steam, I'll just grab one of my other pressing tools that have better ventilation for the vapor to escape. Oh, and in my ironing mat research, there was actually one photo that did feel very relatable. That's me on a very regular basis.